Ethan Carter was not your typical teenager. While most kids his age spent their afternoons playing video games or hanging out at the mall, Ethan preferred the solitude of his family's garage. It wasn't much to look at, just a small, weathered building tucked behind their house, but to Ethan it was a sanctuary. The walls were lined with shelves cluttered with tools, spare parts, and half-finished projects. A rusty workbench stood against one wall, its surface stained with years of oil and grime. In the middle of the room sat an old sedan that Ethan had bought from a neighbor for $200. It didn't run, but that didn't matter to him. To Ethan, this car was more than just metal and rubber. It was a puzzle waiting to be solved. At 16, Ethan already knew more about cars than most adults twice his age. He could take apart an engine and put it back together blindfolded if he had to. His hands were calloused from years of working with wrenches and screwdrivers, and his clothes always smelled faintly of motor oil. But none of that bothered him. In fact, he liked it. Fixing things gave him a sense of purpose, something he often felt was missing in other parts of his life. School was okay, but it didn't excite him the way tinkering with machines did. And while he got along well enough with his classmates, he never felt like he truly belonged. Here, though, in the garage, everything made sense. On this particular afternoon, Ethan was deep in concentration. He lay on a creeper beneath the sedan, adjusting the socket wrench as he tightened a bolt on the transmission. The only sounds in the garage were the occasional clang of metal against metal and the hum of the fluorescent light above. Sweat dripped down his forehead, but he ignored it, focusing instead on the task at hand. This car was going to be his masterpiece, the project that proved he could do anything he set his mind to. Once it was finished, he planned to drive it to school just to show everyone what he was capable of. But before he could finish tightening the last bolt, a loud knock echoed through the garage. Startled, Ethan slid out from under the car and sat up, brushing dirt off his jeans. "Who's there?" he called out, squinting toward the open doorway. The figure standing there was not someone Ethan recognized. Tall and broad-shouldered, the man wore a black leather jacket that looked like it had seen better days. His dark hair was slicked back, and his face carried an expression that sent a chill down Ethan's spine. There was something about the way he stood, hands shoved into his pockets, feet planted firmly on the ground, that made him seem dangerous. "I'm looking for Ethan," the man said, his voice low and gravelly. "That's me," Ethan replied cautiously, rising to his feet. He wiped his greasy hands on a rag and took a step forward. "Can I help you?" The man smirked, revealing a chipped front tooth. "You're the kid who fixes cars around here, right?" "Yeah, I guess so," Ethan said, trying to keep his tone neutral. He didn't like where this conversation was headed. "Well, let me introduce myself." The man took a few steps closer, closing the distance between them. "Name's Victor Kane. I've heard good things about you. People say you're pretty handy with a wrench." Ethan nodded slowly, unsure how to respond. He'd heard of Victor Kane before, not directly, of course, but rumors spread quickly in a small town like Ridgeview. Everyone knew Victor ran with a rough crowd, the kind of people who didn't hesitate to throw their weight around when they wanted something. Still, Ethan tried to stay polite. "Thanks. I try my best." Victor's smile widened, but there was no warmth in it. Good attitude. "Now here's the thing. Running a business, even a little operation like this garage, costs money. And around here, we have a system. You pay your dues, and we make sure nothing bad happens to your place. Understand?" Ethan frowned. "Dues? What are you talking about?" Victor sighed dramatically, as if explaining something obvious to a child. "Protection money. Every week, you give us a cut of whatever you make. It's simple economics, really. We protect you, and you keep doing your thing. No problems." For a moment, Ethan just stared at him, trying to process what he'd just heard. Then anger bubbled up inside him. "I don't have any money to give you," he said firmly. "I barely break even fixing these cars. Most of what I earn goes toward buying parts." Victor's expression darkened. "That's not my problem, kid. You want to keep this garage open, you play by the rules. Otherwise," he let the threat hang in the air, his eyes narrowing. Ethan clenched his fists. He hated bullies, especially ones who thought they could walk all over people just because they were bigger or stronger. "Look, I don't know who you think you are, but I'm not paying you anything. If you've got a problem with that, maybe you should find someone else to bother." Victor's jaw tightened. For a second, it seemed like he might argue, but then he chuckled darkly. "Brave words for a scrawny little mechanic. Let's see how brave you are when I knock those teeth out of your mouth." Before Ethan could react, Victor lunged forward, grabbing him by the collar and slamming him against the workbench. Pain shot through Ethan's back as tools clattered to the floor around him. He struggled to break free, but Victor's grip was like iron. With his free hand, Victor threw a punch, catching Ethan squarely in the jaw. Stars exploded in Ethan's vision as he stumbled backward, collapsing onto the cold concrete. The world spun as Ethan tried to catch his breath. His cheek throbbed and he could taste blood in his mouth. Through the haze of pain, he saw Victor towering over him, sneering. "This is your last warning, kid. Pay up, or next time I won't stop with just a punch." Just as Victor raised his fist again, a sound stopped him in his tracks. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps approaching from outside. Both Ethan and Victor turned toward the doorway, their eyes widening as a figure stepped into view. It was Chuck Norris. He didn't say a word. He didn't need to. His presence alone was enough to silence the entire garage. Clad in a simple denim shirt and boots, Chuck stood there with an air of quiet authority. His cowboy hat cast a shadow over his face, but his piercing gaze left no doubt about his intentions. Victor froze, his confidence faltering. "Who the hell are you?" he stammered, taking a step back. Chuck didn't answer. Instead, he moved with lightning speed, disarming Victor before the thug even realized what was happening. One swift kick sent Victor sprawling to the ground, groaning in pain. Ethan watched in stunned silence, unable to believe what he'd just witnessed. Chuck glanced down at him, offering a small nod before turning his attention back to Victor. "Leave," Chuck said simply, his voice calm but firm. Without another word, Victor scrambled to his feet and bolted out of the garage, leaving behind a trail of dust. As the tension melted away, Ethan slowly rose to his feet, his heart still racing. Who are you?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Chuck tipped his hat slightly and offered a faint smile. "Just passing through." And with that, he turned and walked away, disappearing into the evening light. Ethan stood there, frozen in place, staring at the empty doorway where Chuck Norris had been just moments before. The sound of Victor's retreating footsteps had faded into the distance, leaving behind an eerie silence that filled the garage. Ethan's heart was still racing from the fight, or rather the lack of one now that Chuck had stepped in. He touched his swollen cheek gingerly, wincing at the sharp sting. Despite the pain, he couldn't help but feel a strange sense of wonder. What had just happened? Who was that man? For several minutes, Ethan didn't move. He simply stared at the spot where Chuck had disappeared, replaying the scene over and over in his mind. It all seemed surreal, like something out of a movie. One second, he'd been on the ground, defenseless against Victor's rage. The next, this mysterious stranger had appeared out of nowhere and taken care of everything without even breaking a sweat. How did Chuck know to show up at exactly the right moment? Was it coincidence, or was there something more to it? Finally, Ethan shook his head, trying to snap himself out of his daze. There were questions buzzing around in his brain, but they would have to wait. First, he needed to clean up the mess Victor had made during their brief scuffle. Tools were scattered everywhere, some lying dangerously close to the edge of the workbench. A wrench lay on its side near the open garage door, glinting faintly in the fading light. Ethan bent down to pick it up, grimacing as his muscles protested from the earlier impact. As he worked, his thoughts kept drifting back to Chuck. Something about the man felt different. It wasn't just his martial arts skills or the way he carried himself with such quiet confidence. There was something deeper, almost unexplainable. Ethan had never met anyone like him before. Most people would have walked away from a situation like that, not wanting to get involved. But Chuck hadn't hesitated. He'd stepped in without saying a word, handled the problem effortlessly, and then vanished just as quickly. It was as if he'd been sent specifically to help Ethan. By the time Ethan finished tidying up the garage, night had fallen. The soft glow of the overhead bulb cast long shadows across the room, making the space feel smaller than usual. Exhausted but unable to sleep, Ethan grabbed a stool and sat down near the sedan. He leaned back against the wall, letting his mind wander. For the first time in days, he allowed himself to think about what Victor had said earlier, about paying. Protection money. The idea infuriated him. Ridgeview wasn't exactly a big city, but it wasn't lawless either. Sure, there were rumors about gangs causing trouble in certain neighborhoods, but Ethan had always managed to steer clear of them. Until now. Victor's threat had shaken him, not because he was scared of getting hurt again, but because it felt so unfair. Why should he have to pay someone just to keep doing what he loved? Fixing cars was his passion, his escape from the pressures of school and life. Now, thanks to Victor, even that felt tainted. But then Ethan remembered Chuck's presence, that fleeting moment when the legendary martial artist had stepped into the garage, exuding strength and calmness, had left an impression on him. Maybe Victor wasn't the only force to be reckoned with. Maybe there were people in the world who stood up for others, even when it wasn't easy. People like Chuck? The thought gave Ethan a small spark of hope. If someone like Chuck could step in and make a difference, maybe Ethan could too, in his own way. After all, he wasn't completely powerless. He had skills, knowledge, and determination. Maybe those things counted for something. Over the next few days, Ethan tried to put the incident behind him and focus on his work. He spent hours tinkering with the sedan, determined to get it running smoothly. Each turn of the wrench, each adjustment of the engine, brought him closer to finishing the project. But no matter how hard he focused, he couldn't shake the memory of Chuck Norris. Every time he passed the doorway, he half expected to see the man standing there again, ready to offer another cryptic piece of advice. Word of the confrontation spread quickly through Ridgeview. Neighbors stopped by the garage to check on Ethan, asking if he was okay and offering their support. Some even brought snacks or offered to help with repairs. Ethan appreciated the kindness, but he hated being the center of attention. Still, he couldn't deny that the incident had changed things. People looked at him differently now, not with pity, but with respect. They saw him as someone who refused to back down, even when faced with danger. One afternoon, while Ethan was replacing a brake pad on the sedan, Mrs. Harper, an elderly woman from down the street, came by with a plate of cookies. She set them down on the workbench and smiled warmly. "I heard about what happened," she said. "You're a brave young man, Ethan." Ethan shrugged, feeling a bit embarrassed. "I don't know about brave. I just didn't want to give in to him." "Well, that takes courage," Mrs. Harper replied firmly. "And it sounds like you had some help from a very special person." Ethan paused, his wrench hovering mid-air. "Do you mean Chuck Norris?" Mrs. Harper nodded. "That's what everyone's saying. Folks are talking about how he showed up just in time to save you. Isn't that amazing?" "Yeah," Ethan murmured, thinking about it again. "It really is." After Mrs. Harper left, Ethan found himself wondering why Chuck had chosen to intervene. Surely there were bigger problems in the world that needed fixing. Why waste time on a kid like him? Unless Chuck believed that every act of kindness mattered, no matter how small. Maybe he saw potential in Ethan, even if Ethan didn't see it in himself. Inspired by the thought, Ethan decided to take action. If Chuck could inspire change just by showing up, maybe Ethan could do the same in his own way. He started reaching out to other kids in the neighborhood, inviting them to come by the garage after school. At first, only a couple of curious teenagers showed up, eager to learn how to fix bikes or replace flat tires. But soon the group grew larger, and Ethan found himself teaching lessons he hadn't realized he knew. He showed them how to use tools safely, how to diagnose problems, and most importantly, how to believe in themselves. Many of the kids came from families struggling to make ends meet, and learning basic repair skills gave them a sense of independence they'd never had before. Ethan watched proudly as they worked together, laughing and sharing stories while they learned. For the Bao, first time in a long time, he felt like he was making a real difference. Meanwhile, Victor Kane wasn't done causing trouble. Though he avoided the garage for a while, Ethan could tell he was planning something. Rumors circulated that Victor was furious about losing face in front of everyone, and especially in front of Chuck Norris. No one knew for sure what he intended to do, but Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that it wouldn't end well. Late one evening, as Ethan locked up the garage, he noticed a flicker of movement out of the corner of his eye. He turned quickly, scanning the shadows around the property. Nothing seemed out of place, but the sensation of being watched lingered. Ethan shook his head, telling himself he was probably just imagining things. Still, he made sure to double-check the locks before heading inside. Little did he know, trouble was brewing just beyond the horizon, and when it arrived, it wouldn't come alone. Ethan had always trusted his instincts. They'd kept him safe more times than he could count, whether it was avoiding a loose wire while working on an engine or steering clear of troublemakers at school. So when that nagging feeling of being watched returned, stronger this time, he knew better than to ignore it. Something wasn't right. It started small, a strange noise outside late at night like footsteps crunching on gravel. Then came the occasional flicker of headlights passing by too slowly, as if someone were casing the place. Ethan tried to convince himself it was nothing, just paranoia left over from his run-in with Victor Kane. But deep down, he knew better. Victor wasn't the type to let things go. Not after losing face in front of everyone, and especially not after Chuck Norris humiliated him. One evening, as Ethan closed up the garage, he decided to take precautions. He couldn't fight off thugs like Chuck could, but he wasn't completely defenseless either. Using spare parts lying around, he rigged up a few traps, tripwires connected to hanging cans filled with nuts and bolts, motion-activated floodlights aimed at the driveway, and even a makeshift alarm system using old car horns wired to pressure plates near the entrance. It wasn't perfect, but it would give him enough warning if anyone tried to sneak in. Despite these preparations, Ethan still felt uneasy. Sleep didn't come easily that night. Every creak of the house sounded louder than usual. Every shadow, darker. He tossed and turned, replaying scenarios in his head. What if Victor showed up with friends? What if they trashed the garage? What if they hurt someone else? The what-ifs circled endlessly until finally, exhaustion pulled him into a restless slumber. The attack came just after midnight. Ethan woke suddenly to the sound of clanging metal. At first he thought it was part of a dream, but then he heard it again. Louder this time, followed by muffled voices outside. His heart raced as he scrambled out of bed and peeked through the window. Sure enough, 3 figures were creeping toward the garage, their shapes barely visible in the dim light. One of them carried a crowbar, another held what looked like a flashlight. Even in the darkness, Ethan recognized the leader immediately, Victor Kane. Adrenaline surged through Ethan's veins. For a moment, panic threatened to overwhelm him. But then he remembered the traps he'd set up. Taking a deep breath, he grabbed a baseball bat from his closet and crept downstairs, careful not to make a sound. If everything worked as planned, the intruders wouldn't get far. Victor and his crew reached the garage moments later. Jake, the tallest of the group, pushed open the door cautiously, scanning the interior for signs of movement. Ryan, the smallest, but scrappiest of the trio, stayed close behind, gripping a tire iron tightly. Neither of them noticed the thin wire stretched across the threshold until it was too late. The cans exploded into life, crashing together noisily and sending echoes throughout the neighborhood. Startled, Victor cursed under his breath and swung, his flashlight around wildly, searching for the source of the commotion. That's when the floodlights kicked on, bathing the garage in harsh white light. Blinded temporarily, the 3 thugs stumbled backward, shielding their eyes. "What the hell is this?" Victor growled, squinting against the glare. Before they could recover, the next trap sprang into action. A pressure plate near the doorway triggered a loud honk from a nearby car horn, startling them further. Jake tripped over a loose wrench, landing hard on the concrete floor. Ryan dropped his tire iron in surprise, scrambling to pick it up again. Chaos reigned as the trio flailed about, trying to regain control of the situation. Ethan watched from the safety of his house, gripping the baseball bat tightly. He wanted to step in, to confront them directly. But he knew better than to underestimate Victor. Instead, he waited, hoping the traps would buy him enough time for help to arrive, or for the thugs to retreat. But just as Victor regained his footing and prepared to storm deeper into the garage, a new figure appeared in the doorway. Silhouetted against the soft glow of the streetlights, the man stood perfectly still, his presence commanding immediate attention. It was Chuck Norris. Chuck didn't say a word. He simply stepped inside, his boots making barely a sound against the concrete floor. The thugs froze, their bravado evaporating instantly. Victor's jaw tightened as he stared at the legendary martial artist, clearly recognizing him from their last encounter. "You've got to be kidding me," Victor muttered, taking a hesitant step back. Chuck raised an eyebrow, his expression unreadable. Without warning, he moved faster than any of them could react. In one fluid motion, he disarmed Jake and Ryan, sending their weapons clattering harmlessly to the ground. Then with a swift kick, he sent Victor sprawling onto his back, knocking the wind out of him. The entire sequence took less than 10 seconds. By the time it was over, all three thugs lay groaning on the floor, utterly defeated. Chuck glanced down at them briefly before turning his attention to Ethan, who now stood in the doorway of the house, staring in disbelief. "Stay out of trouble," Chuck said calmly, tipping his hat slightly, and with that he walked away, disappearing into the night as quietly as he'd arrived. For several long moments, Ethan just stood there, processing what had happened. The garage was a mess, tools scattered everywhere and the sedan slightly dented, from where Jake had fallen against it. But none of that mattered compared to the relief flooding through him. Once again, Chuck Norris had saved the day, and once again he'd done it without asking for anything in return. As the reality sank in, Ethan realized something important. Chuck hadn't intervened because he thought Ethan was weak or incapable. He'd done it because sometimes people needed help standing up for themselves. And now, thanks to Chuck's example, Ethan understood exactly what he needed to do next. He called the sheriff, who arrived within minutes to arrest Victor and his crew. The officers listened patiently as Ethan explained what had happened, nodding sympathetically when he described the traps he'd set up. By the time they hauled the thugs away in handcuffs, the whole neighborhood was awake, drawn by the commotion. Neighbors gathered outside, murmuring amongst themselves as they watched the scene unfold. Mrs. Harper approached Ethan, her eyes wide with concern. "Are you okay, dear?" she asked gently. Ethan nodded, managing a small smile. "I'm fine. Just tired." She patted his shoulder reassuringly. "You did good, Ethan, real good." As the crowd dispersed and the police cars drove off into the distance, Ethan returned to the garage to assess the damage. It would take some work to clean everything up, but he didn't mind. In fact, he welcomed the task. Fixing things was what he did best, not just cars, but situations, problems, and even himself. And as he bent down to pick up a fallen wrench, Ethan couldn't help but glance toward the doorway one last time. Though Chuck Norris was long gone, his influence lingered, reminding Ethan that strength wasn't just about physical power, it was about courage, compassion, and knowing when to act. With renewed determination, Ethan got to work. The night might have been chaotic, but tomorrow promised a fresh start, and this time he was ready. The days that followed Victor Kane's arrest brought a surprising change to Ridgeview. For years, the neighborhood had lived under the shadow of fear of thugs like Victor and his crew, who bullied people into submission. But now, thanks to Ethan Carter and the mysterious intervention of Chuck Norris, things were different. Word spread quickly about what had happened in the garage that night, how Ethan had outsmarted the intruders with clever traps, and how Chuck had stepped in to finish the job. It became a story everyone talked about, the kind of tale that made you believe good could still triumph over evil. Ethan noticed the shift almost immediately. Neighbors who used to avoid eye contact now greeted him warmly when they passed by. Kids from school started showing up at the garage more often, eager to learn from him or just hang out. Even Mr. Dawson, the grumpy old man who lived 2 blocks away, stopped by one afternoon to shake Ethan's hand. "You've got guts, kid," he said gruffly before shuffling off, leaving Ethan both confused and oddly proud. But it wasn't just the attention that changed things. It was how Ethan felt about himself. Before all this, he'd always thought of himself as just a mechanic, someone who fixed cars because he didn't know what else to do. Now, though, he realized he was capable of much more. Standing up to Victor, even if it meant getting hurt, had taught him something important. Courage wasn't about being fearless, it was about acting despite your fears. And setting those traps? That had been smart thinking, proof that brains could be just as powerful as brawn. Inspired by everything that had happened, Ethan decided to take his skills further. He began volunteering at the local community center, teaching kids basic mechanics and encouraging them to pursue their passions. At first, only a handful of children showed up. Most were curious but unsure if they belonged there. Ethan understood that feeling all too well, so he went out of his way to make everyone feel welcome. He showed them how to use tools safely, explained the basics of engines, and shared stories about his own projects. Slowly but surely, word got around, and soon the classes grew bigger. One Saturday morning, Ethan arrived at the community center early to set up for the day's lesson. As he arranged wrenches and screwdrivers on a table, he noticed a familiar face among the group of kids waiting outside. It was Mia Harper, Mrs. Harper's granddaughter. She was 9 years old, with bright eyes and a mop of curly red hair. Ethan smiled as she waved shyly at him. "Hey, Mia," he said, crouching down to her level. "What brings you here?" Mia shrugged, clutching a small notebook to her chest. "I want to fix stuff like you do." Ethan chuckled. "Well, you've come to the right place. Let's get started, shall we?" As the morning wore on, Ethan found himself enjoying the session more than usual. The kids were enthusiastic, asking questions and laughing as they worked together. Mia turned out to be particularly talented, carefully following Ethan's instructions and even suggesting creative solutions to problems. By the end of the class, she had successfully assembled a simple pulley system using scraps Ethan had lying around. "You're really good at this," Ethan told her as they packed up. "Keep practicing and someday you'll be able to build anything you want." Mia beamed at the compliment. "Thanks, Ethan, you're the best teacher ever." Her words stayed with him long after the kids had gone home. Teaching wasn't something Ethan had ever imagined himself doing, but now he couldn't picture his life without it. Watching these kids discover their potential reminded him of why he loved fixing things in the first place. It wasn't just about solving problems. It was about creating something meaningful. Meanwhile, Victor Kane's absence had left a noticeable void in the neighborhood. Without his intimidation tactics, other troublemakers seemed to lose their nerve. A few of Victor's former associates tried to stir up trouble elsewhere, but they quickly backed off when rumors circulated about Chuck Norris still keeping an eye on Ridgeview. Whether or not Chuck was actually around didn't matter. His reputation alone was enough to keep people in line. Ethan often wondered if he would ever see Chuck again. Every time he passed the spot where the martial artist had disappeared, he half expected to find him standing there, ready to offer another piece of wisdom. But Chuck never reappeared, at least not in person. Instead, his influence lingered in subtler ways, in the way Ethan carried himself, the choices he made, and the lessons he passed on to others. One evening, as Ethan closed up the garage, he reflected on everything that had changed. The sedan he'd been working on was finally running smoothly, its engine purring like a contented cat. He climbed behind the wheel and turned the key, listening to the satisfying hum. This car had been more than just a project. It had been a symbol of resilience, proof that hard work paid off. Tomorrow he planned to drive it to school just as he'd dreamed of doing months ago. But this time, it felt different. This time it wasn't just about showing off. It was about proving to himself that he could overcome any obstacle. As Ethan locked the garage door and headed inside, he noticed a figure walking down the street. At first, he thought it was just another neighbor out for an evening stroll. But as the figure drew closer, his heart skipped a beat. It was Chuck Norris. Chuck tipped his cowboy hat and gave Ethan a small nod. "Evening." Ethan blinked, momentarily speechless. Hi. What are you doing here?" I was passing through, Chuck replied simply, glancing at the garage. Thought I'd check in. Oh. Ethan hesitated, unsure what to say next. Well, thanks for stopping by. Again. Chuck smiled faintly. You don't need to thank me. You handled yourself pretty well last time. Ethan scratched the back of his neck, feeling a bit embarrassed. I couldn't have done it without you. That's not true, Chuck said firmly. You stood your ground. You protected what mattered. That takes real strength. Ethan looked down at his feet, letting the words sink in. When he finally glanced back up, Chuck was already turning to leave. Wait, Ethan called out impulsively. Can I ask you something? Chuck paused, raising an eyebrow. Sure. Why did you help me? Ethan asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I mean, you didn't have to. So why did you? For a moment, Chuck didn't answer. Then he spoke, his tone calm but sincere. Because sometimes people need a reminder that good still exists. And because I saw something in you worth protecting. With that, he tipped his hat once more and walked away, disappearing into the twilight. Ethan watched him go, his chest swelling with gratitude and determination. Chuck's words echoed in his mind, reinforcing everything he'd learned over the past few weeks. The next morning, Ethan woke up early, feeling lighter than he had in ages. He grabbed his tools and headed to the garage, ready to tackle whatever challenges lay ahead. Ridgeview might not be perfect, but it was better than it had been, and Ethan knew he had played a part in making it that way. From that day forward, Ethan vowed to live by the lessons Chuck had taught him. Stand up for what's right, protect those who can't protect themselves, and never underestimate the power of kindness. Because sometimes, all it took was one person to step in and remind the world that good still existed, and if anyone needed reminding, Ethan Carter would be there to do it. Months had passed since Chuck Norris last walked through Ridgeview, but his impact lingered like ripples in a pond. The town felt different now, brighter, safer, more hopeful. Victor Kane's gang had disbanded entirely, their members either moving away or laying low after the events at Ethan's garage. Even the neighbors who once kept to themselves seemed friendlier, waving hello as they passed by on the sidewalk. Ridgeview wasn't perfect, but it was better than it had been, and Ethan Carter knew he had played a small part in making it that way. Ethan's life had changed too. What started as a hobby tinkering with cars in his family's old garage had grown into something much bigger. His volunteer work at the community center became a regular fixture, attracting kids of all ages who wanted to learn how to fix things. Some came because they needed a skill. Others came because they admired Ethan. Either way, he welcomed them all, teaching not just mechanics but also patience, problem-solving, and teamwork. Mia Harper, Mrs. Harper's granddaughter, quickly became one of Ethan's star students. Her natural curiosity and knack for details made her a quick learner, and she often stayed late to help clean up or ask questions about projects she'd seen online. One day, while Ethan was explaining how to rebuild a carburetor, Mia looked up at him with wide eyes. "Do you think I could ever build my own car someday?" she asked earnestly. Ethan smiled, crouching down to her level. "Of course you can. You've got the brains and the determination. If you keep working hard, there's nothing you won't be able to do." Her face lit up at his words, and Ethan felt a swell of pride. Watching these kids grow and dream reminded him of why he loved what he did. It wasn't just about fixing engines. It was about helping people believe in themselves. But Ethan didn't stop there. Inspired by Chuck's example, he decided to take his efforts beyond the community center. He began organizing weekend workshops for adults, showing them how to perform basic repairs on their vehicles so they wouldn't have to rely on expensive mechanics. Word spread quickly, and soon people from neighboring towns were driving to Ridgeview to attend his sessions. Ethan never charged a dime, insisting that knowledge should be shared freely. One Saturday afternoon, as Ethan wrapped up a workshop, an older man approached him with a grateful smile. "You've saved me hundreds of dollars this year," the man said, shaking Ethan's hand firmly. "Thank you for everything." Ethan shrugged modestly. "Just paying it forward." The phrase stuck with him long after the man left. Paying it forward. That's exactly what Chuck Norris had done for him. By stepping in when no one else would, Chuck had shown Ethan that even small acts of kindness could create big changes. And now Ethan was doing the same, passing along the lessons he'd learned to anyone willing to listen. As summer turned to fall, Ethan finally finished his masterpiece, the sedan he'd bought months ago for $200. After countless hours of work, replacing parts, sanding rust, and painting it a glossy midnight blue, the car gleamed like new. Its engine purred smoothly, and every detail, from the polished chrome rims to the custom decals along the sides, reflected Ethan's dedication. On the morning of its debut, Ethan invited everyone he knew to come see the finished product. Neighbors gathered outside the garage, chatting excitedly as Ethan rolled the car out into the driveway. Kids pressed their faces against the windows, marveling at the sleek interior, while adults nodded approvingly at the craftsmanship. "This is incredible. Ethan," Mrs. Harper said, patting him on the shoulder, "you should be proud." "I am," Ethan replied, grinning. "But I couldn't have done it without all of you." When he climbed behind the wheel and turned the key, the crowd erupted into applause. The sound of the engine echoed down the street, drawing even more attention. For a moment, Ethan sat there, soaking it all in, the cheers, the smiles, the sense of accomplishment. This was more than just a car. It was proof that hard work and perseverance paid off. Later that evening, as Ethan parked the sedan back in the garage, he took a moment to reflect. So much had changed in such a short time. He thought about Victor Kane, whose threats had once filled him with fear, and how those fears now seemed laughably small. He thought about Chuck Norris, whose quiet strength had inspired him to stand up for himself and others. Most of all, he thought about the future. Not just his own, but the futures of the kids he taught and the community he served. As he locked up the garage and headed inside, Ethan spotted a figure walking down the road. At first he thought it was just another neighbor out for an evening stroll, but as the figure drew closer, his heart skipped a beat. It was Chuck Norris. Chuck tipped his cowboy hat and gave Ethan a small nod. "Evening." Ethan blinked, momentarily, speechless. Hi. What are you doing here?" "I was passing through," Chuck replied simply, glancing at the garage. "Thought I'd check in." "Oh." Ethan hesitated, unsure what to say next. "Well, thanks for stopping by. Again." Chuck smiled faintly. "You don't need to thank me. You handled yourself pretty well last time." Ethan scratched the back of his neck, feeling a bit embarrassed. "I couldn't have done it without you." "That's not true," Chuck said firmly. "You stood your ground. You protected what mattered. That takes real strength." Ethan looked down at his feet, letting the words sink in. When he finally glanced back up, Chuck was already turning to leave. "Wait," Ethan called out impulsively. "Can I ask you something?" Chuck paused, raising an eyebrow. "Sure." "Why did you help me?" Ethan asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "I mean, you didn't have to. So why did you?" For a moment, Chuck didn't answer. Then he spoke, his tone calm but sincere, "Because sometimes people need a reminder that good still exists, and because I saw something in you worth protecting." With that, he tipped his hat once more and walked away, disappearing into the twilight. Ethan watched him go, his chest swelling with gratitude and determination. Chuck's words echoed in his mind, reinforcing everything he'd learned over the past few months. From that day forward, Ethan vowed to live by the lessons Chuck had taught him. Stand up for what's right, protect those who can't protect themselves, and never underestimate the power of kindness. Because sometimes all it took was one person to step in and remind the world that good still existed. And if anyone needed reminding, Ethan Carter would be there to do it. As the seasons changed and years went by, Ethan continued to make a difference. In Ridgeview, his garage became a hub of creativity and learning, a place where people came not just to fix things but to find hope and inspiration. And though Chuck Norris never returned, his legacy lived on, in Ethan's actions and the smiles of the kids he taught. and in the renewed spirit of a town that had rediscovered its strength. Sometimes Ethan would sit in the garage late at night, listening to the hum of the fluorescent light overhead. He'd think about Chuck and wonder where he was now, what other lives he might be touching. But mostly, he'd think about the future. A future shaped by courage, compassion, and the belief that even the smallest act of kindness could change the world. And as long as Ethan Carter was around, Ridgeview would always have someone willing to step in and set things right.